Hashtag the soldier who changed the war, a true untold WW2 story. January 17th, 1940. The forests of eastern Finland are silent in the way only winter can make them. A silence so complete it presses against the eardrums like water at depth. The temperature has fallen to 40 degrees below zero. In this frozen cathedral of pine and birch, a young German military observer named Klaus Richter crouches behind a snow-laden spruce, his breath crystallizing before his face in tiny clouds that vanish almost instantly. He has been sent here by the Wehrmacht's intelligence division to study Soviet tactics during their invasion of Finland, to learn what he can about the enemy Germany will inevitably face. But at this moment, Richter is not thinking about tactics or strategy. He is thinking about his fingers, which have gone numb inside his wool gloves, and about the thin soup he ate 12 hours ago that now feels like a lifetime's distance from his empty stomach. Through his field glasses, he watches a column of Red Army soldiers trudging through the deep snow. They move like ghosts through the tree line, hunched and miserable, their greatcoats stiff with ice. Suddenly, the forest erupts. Not with sound, not at first, but with movement. White-clad figures materialize from the snow itself, Finnish ski troops who seem to have been conjured from the landscape. The crack of rifle fire follows, sharp reports that echo through the frozen air. Within minutes, it is over. The Soviet column is destroyed, and the white ghosts have vanished back into the wilderness as silently as they appeared. Richter makes notes in his journal with hands that shake from cold, and something else, a kind of awe. He writes about mobility, about the psychological advantage of soldiers who understand their terrain, about the devastating effectiveness of small units operating with independence and initiative. He does not yet know that he is witnessing something that will haunt him for years to come. He does not know that the lessons being written in blood on this frozen ground will mean nothing when measured against a force he cannot yet imagine, a force not of tactics or training, but of industrial might and democratic abundance, so vast it will remake the very nature of warfare. 5 years later, Richter will stand in the ruins of Berlin, watching American trucks roll through streets he no longer recognizes, and he will remember this moment. He will remember the Finnish soldiers appearing from the snow, and he will understand that all the tactical brilliance in the world meant nothing against an enemy that could simply produce more tanks, more planes, more food, more fuel, more of everything than the human mind could properly comprehend. But in January 1940, he knows none of this. He only knows the cold and the hunger and the terrible efficiency of desperate men defending their homeland. To understand how one soldier changed the war, we must first understand what war meant to those who waged it. In the winter of 1940, the German military machine was the most formidable fighting force the world had ever seen. The Wehrmacht had conquered Poland in 27 days. Its officers had studied the failures of the Great War and had forged something new, Blitzkrieg, lightning war, a doctrine of speed and concentrated force that seemed to render obsolete the static trench warfare that had devoured a generation. German soldiers believed themselves to be members of a superior military caste, heirs to the Prussian tradition, warriors who represented the pinnacle of military evolution. This was not mere propaganda, though propaganda certainly reinforced it. It was a belief rooted in observable reality. German tanks were superior to most of their opponents. German aircraft dominated the skies over Poland and would soon dominate the skies over France. German tactical doctrine emphasized initiative at the lowest levels, allowing sergeants and lieutenants to make decisions that in other armies would require approval from colonels or generals. The German soldier was well-trained, well-led, and imbued with an ideology that told him he was fighting for the survival and supremacy of his people. When Klaus Richter returned from Finland in February 1940, he submitted his report to his superiors in the Abwehr, German military intelligence. His observations about Soviet tactical incompetence were well received. The Red Army, after all, had struggled to defeat tiny Finland, suffering catastrophic casualties in the process. Stalin's purges had gutted the Soviet officer corps. The performance of Soviet forces in Finland seemed to confirm what German planners already believed, that the USSR was a colossus with feet of clay, a vast but primitive nation whose military could be defeated in a single decisive campaign. Richter's other observations about the effectiveness of decentralized command, about the importance of logistics in extreme conditions, about the resilience of soldiers fighting for their homeland, were noted but not emphasized. The German High Command was already planning the conquest of Western Europe. The lessons of Finland seemed relevant only to the eventual campaign against the Soviet Union, which was still more than a year away. On May 10, 1940, German forces invaded France, Belgium, and the Netherlands. Within 6 weeks, France had fallen. British forces had been evacuated from Dunkirk, leaving behind their heavy equipment. The Third Reich now controlled territory from the North Cape of Norway to the Pyrenees, from the Atlantic coast to the borders of the Soviet Union. The German soldier's belief in his own superiority seemed not just justified but conservatively stated. No military force in history had achieved such sweeping victories in so short a time. Klaus Richter, now a captain, marched through the Arc de Triomphe in Paris on June 14, 1940. Around him, German soldiers sang and laughed. Some wept with joy. They had avenged the humiliation of 1918. They had proven themselves the masters of Europe. The City of Light lay at their feet, and the war, surely, was all but won. Britain would see reason and negotiate peace. The Reich would endure for 1,000 years. Richter sang with his comrades, but in the back of his mind, unbidden, came the memory of white-clad Finnish soldiers appearing from the snow. He pushed the thought away. Finland had been a sideshow, a minor conflict on the periphery of Europe. This was the real war, and Germany had won it. He could not have been more wrong. On December 7, 1941, Japanese aircraft attacked the American naval base at Pearl Harbor. 4 days later, Adolf Hitler declared war on the United States, a decision that historian John Keegan would later describe as the greatest strategic blunder of the Second World War. At the time, it seemed almost inconsequential to the German High Command. America was far away, separated from Europe by an ocean. Its army ranked 18th in the world, smaller than that of Romania. Its tanks were inferior to German models. Its soldiers were untested. The United States was a nation of shopkeepers and factory workers, grown soft from prosperity, lacking the martial spirit that animated the warriors of the Reich. Japanese planners shared similar assumptions about American will and capability. They had studied American culture and concluded that a democracy devoted to individual comfort and material wealth could not sustain the sacrifices necessary for a long war. Americans, they believed, would fight 1 or 2 battles, suffer casualties, and then sue for peace. The Japanese soldier, trained to value death over surrender, indoctrinated with the spirit of Bushido, seemed to possess a spiritual advantage that no amount of industrial production could overcome. Both Germany and Japan made the same fundamental error. They confused tactical skill and ideological fervor with strategic depth. They measured military capability in terms of the quality of individual soldiers and weapons, not in terms of industrial capacity and national resources. They believed that wars were won by warriors, not by factories. Lieutenant Werner Scholz was 24 years old when he arrived in North Africa in March 1941. He commanded a platoon of Panzer Grenadiers in the 5th Light Division, part of the Afrika Korps under the command of Erwin Rommel. Scholz was a veteran of the French campaign, holder of the Iron Cross Second Class, a true believer in National Socialism and in German military superiority. He had grown up in Munich, the son of a brewery owner who had lost everything in the hyperinflation of 1923. Werner had joined the Hitler Youth at 14, the Wehrmacht at 18. The army had given him purpose, belonging, a sense of destiny larger than himself. In the desert, Scholz discovered a kind of war he had not known in Europe. Here, there were no civilians to complicate operations, no cities to garrison, no infrastructure to capture and hold. It was pure war, mobile and lethal, a contest between machines and the men who crewed them. The British were competent opponents, especially their tanks crews and artillery units, but the Afrika Korps consistently outfought them. Rommel's tactical genius, combined with the superior training and initiative of German units, produced victory after victory. By June 1942, the Afrika Korps stood at El Alamein, just 60 miles from Alexandria. Cairo seemed within reach, and beyond it, the Suez Canal and the oil fields of the Middle East. Scholz wrote letters home describing the desert, the impossible heat, the flies, the fine sand that infiltrated everything, the strange beauty of sunset over the dunes. He wrote about the camaraderie of his men, about the respect he felt for their British opponents, about his conviction that Germany was fighting for its rightful place as the dominant power in Europe and the Mediterranean. What he did not write about, because he did not yet understand its significance, was the increasing difficulty of obtaining supplies. The Africa Corps was at the end of a long, tenuous supply line that stretched across the Mediterranean from Italy. British submarines, operating from Malta, sank German and Italian supply ships with increasing regularity. Fuel was rationed. Ammunition was precious. Food became monotonous. Canned meat, hard bread, ersatz coffee that tasted like burnt wood. The German soldier in North Africa learned to make do with less, to improvise, to repair vehicles with scavenged parts. This resourcefulness was celebrated as a virtue, another proof of German superiority over materially dependent adversaries. Then, in November 1942, everything changed. The soldier who changed the war was not a general or a hero in the traditional sense. He was not even a single individual, but rather a composite, a symbol of something that German and Japanese planners had failed to comprehend. He was the American GI, the ordinary citizen soldier of the United States Armed Forces, and he arrived in North Africa carrying with him the full weight of American industrial might. Werner Scholz first encountered American forces at a place called Kasserine Pass in February 1943. The initial engagements seemed to confirm German assumptions. The Americans were green, poorly coordinated, easily panicked. German forces inflicted heavy casualties and captured substantial numbers of prisoners. Scholz and his men examined the abandoned American positions with a mixture of contempt and confusion. The confusion stemmed from the sheer quantity of material the Americans had left behind. There were trucks, dozens of them, many abandoned not because they were damaged but simply because they had run out of fuel or gotten stuck. There were crates of ammunition, more than a German platoon would expect to receive in a month. There were rations, and it was the rations that truly bewildered Scholz and his men. Each American soldier carried a small cardboard box labeled K ration. Inside were cans of meat, cheese, crackers, chocolate, sugar, coffee, cigarettes, and chewing gum. The quantity and quality of food allocated to a single American soldier for a single day exceeded what a German soldier might expect to receive in a week. Scholz's men fell upon these rations like starving wolves, not because they were literally starving, though supplies had been short, but because they could not believe such abundance was real. Scholz picked up a chocolate bar. It was wrapped in paper and foil, manufactured in a factory somewhere in America, shipped across an ocean, transported across North Africa, and issued to a common soldier as casually as if it were a rifle round. He held it in his hand, feeling its weight, and for the first time, a small cold doubt entered his mind. How many factories did it take to produce these chocolate bars for millions of soldiers? How many ships to transport them? How many trucks to distribute them? And if America could afford to give its soldiers chocolate, in the middle of a desert war, what else could it afford? The doubt did not last long. The Africa Corps regrouped, and under Rommel's leadership, they prepared to resume the offensive. But 3 months later, the Africa Corps surrendered. 250,000 German and Italian soldiers became prisoners of war, the largest German capitulation since Stalingrad. Werner Scholz was among them. As a prisoner, Scholz was transported to a camp in Algeria. The journey took 3 days in the back of an American truck. It was a GMC CCKW, a 6x6 cargo truck that American soldiers called a Jimmy. The truck ran smoothly, never broke down, never needed repairs. The American driver seemed almost bored, as if transporting prisoners across North Africa was a routine inconvenience rather than a military operation. At the camp, Scholz and his fellow prisoners were processed, documented, and fed. The meal was simple: canned stew, white bread, coffee, but the portions were generous. More importantly, it was clear that this was standard issue, not a special provision. The Americans fed their prisoners the same rations they fed their own soldiers. Scholz began to pay attention to details. He observed that every American soldier seemed to have a wristwatch. German soldiers who owned watches typically brought them from home. They were personal property, not standard issue. American soldiers received watches from their military. He observed that Americans wasted food, scraping half-eaten meals into garbage cans without a second thought. He observed the endless stream of trucks bringing supplies to the camp: food, medicine, building materials, fuel. The trucks came every day, regular as clockwork, and there always seemed to be more trucks. One evening, Scholz struck up a conversation with an American guard named Eddie Wilkins, a farm boy from Iowa who spoke a little German learned from his grandparents. Wilkins was 19 years old, cheerful and uncomplicated, utterly lacking in ideological fervor. He seemed to view the war as an unfortunate interruption to his real life rather than as a cosmic struggle for racial supremacy. Scholz asked Wilkins why he fought. The American looked confused by the question. "It's my duty," he said finally. "We were attacked. We have to win so we can go home." "But why do you believe you will win?" Scholz pressed. "Germany has never been defeated on the battlefield except by overwhelming numbers." Wilkins shrugged. "We've got the numbers. We've got the factories. We can make more tanks and planes than you guys can blow up. It's just math." "It's just math." The phrase haunted Scholz. The American said it without pride or boasting, as if he were stating an obvious truth that required no elaboration. And Scholz realized, with a sinking feeling in his chest, that Wilkins was right. The war was not a contest of ideologies or warrior spirits. It was arithmetic, and Germany was on the wrong side of the equation. By mid-1943, the full weight of American production had reached the battlefield. The United States was building aircraft carriers at a rate of one every 6 weeks. It was producing tanks faster than Germany could destroy them. Ford's Willow Run factory alone was manufacturing B-24 Liberator bombers at a rate of 1 per hour. American shipyards launched more tonnage in 1943 than Japan had built in its entire history. The statistics are almost incomprehensible in their magnitude. During the entire war, Germany produced approximately 90,000 aircraft. The United States produced 300,000. Germany manufactured 67,000 tanks and self-propelled guns. The United States manufactured 88,000 tanks, 257,000 artillery pieces, 2.4 million trucks, and 657,000 jeeps. American factories delivered 6,500 ships, 5,600 merchant vessels, and produced more ammunition than Britain, Germany, and Japan combined. But numbers alone do not capture the psychological impact of American abundance on those who opposed it. The German and Japanese soldier had been taught that his material poverty was a source of strength, that it fostered resourcefulness and resilience. The hardships of war, short rations, worn equipment, improvised repairs, were reframed as character-building exercises. The enemy's abundance, by contrast, was evidence of softness, of dependence on material comfort. This ideological framework collapsed upon contact with reality. German soldiers who encountered American forces in Italy, France, and Germany itself were not facing soft, comfort-dependent troops. They were facing well-fed, well-equipped soldiers who fought with a confidence that came from knowing they would never run out of ammunition, fuel, or food. The psychological advantage of tactical skill eroded when every tactical success was answered by a fresh wave of men and material that seemed to have no end. Klaus Richter, the observer who had watched Finnish ski troops destroy a Soviet column in 1940, was now a major in Army Group Center on the Eastern Front. By 1944, the Wehrmacht was in full retreat from the Soviet Union. The Red Army that had performed so poorly in Finland had been transformed into a mechanized juggernaut, and much of that transformation had been enabled by American aid. Through the Lend-Lease program, the United States shipped to the Soviet Union 400,000 trucks, 12,000 armored vehicles, 11,000 aircraft, 1.75 million tons of food, 15 million pairs of boots, and 13 million tons of steel. Soviet Marshal Georgy Zhukov would later acknowledge that without American trucks, the Red Army could not have maintained its mobile warfare operations. Soviet factories focused on producing tanks and artillery. American factories provided the logistical foundation that allowed those weapons to reach the front. Richter watch Studebaker trucks, manufactured in Indiana, shipped across the Pacific to Vladivostok, and driven thousands of miles across Siberia, carry Soviet troops into battle against his unit. He watched as American-made jeeps carried Soviet officers. He ate captured Soviet rations and found American canned goods among them. The global nature of American production was itself a weapon, one that revealed the fundamental strategic bankruptcy of the Axis cause. In June 1944, Allied forces landed in Normandy. Within weeks, they had established a lodgment in France and begun the liberation of Western Europe. Richter, stationed in the east, received reports about the invasion from retreating units and from official Wehrmacht communiques that grew increasingly vague and euphemistic. But he also received information from soldiers who had been transferred from the West, and their stories had a consistent theme: the sheer overwhelming material superiority of the Allied forces. These soldiers spoke of the Jabos, the Allied fighter-bombers that ruled the skies over France, strafing and bombing any German unit that moved during daylight hours. They spoke of American artillery that fired shells with such profligacy that the ground itself seemed to turn liquid. They spoke of the endless columns of American trucks, each one identical to the next, all of them running smoothly, all of them maintained by mechanics who had access to unlimited spare parts. They spoke of American field kitchens that served hot meals to frontline troops, of American medics with abundant supplies of morphine and plasma, of American engineers who could build a bridge across a river in a single night. And they spoke of something else, something harder to define, but perhaps more demoralizing than any material factor. They spoke of the casual confidence of the American soldier, his relaxed demeanor, his apparent belief that victory was inevitable and that his role was simply to show up and do his job. The American did not fight with the fanaticism of an SS man or the fatalistic resignation of a late-war conscript. He fought like a professional doing professional work, and when the day's fighting was done, he ate his hot meal and wrote letters home and listened to American music on portable radios that seemed as standard issue as rifles. By the winter of 1944, Werner Scholz had been a prisoner of war for more than a year. He had been transferred from North Africa to a camp in the United States in rural Pennsylvania. The journey itself had been instructive: a ship across the Atlantic, comfortable even by prisoner standards, then a train across the American continent. Scholz had pressed his face against the window of the train car, watching the landscape roll past. He saw cities that showed no evidence of bombing, factories belching smoke into the sky, farms stretching to the horizon, grain elevators and stockyards and rail yards, all the infrastructure of abundance. The camp in Pennsylvania was situated near a small town. The prisoners worked on local farms, harvesting crops under the supervision of guards who seemed more bored than vigilant. The farmers paid the American government for the labor, and the prisoners received token wages that they could spend at the camp canteen. It was all very orderly, very bureaucratic, very American. Scholz found himself working for a farmer named Henry Kowalski, whose parents had immigrated from Poland. Kowalski spoke some Polish, and over time, he and Scholz developed a limited communication in a mixture of Polish, German, and gestures. Kowalski was gruff, but not unkind. He worked alongside the prisoners, and at midday his wife brought lunch to the field: sandwiches, fruit, thermoses of coffee. One day, Scholz asked Kowalski if he had sons in the military. Kowalski nodded. 2 boys, he said. One in the Pacific, one in Europe. Don't know where exactly. They can't say in their letters. You must hate us, Scholz said. Germans. For making war on your family. Kowalski was silent for a moment, chewing his sandwich. Then he shrugged. I hate Hitler, he said. I don't know about you. You seem all right. You work hard. This answer puzzled Scholz. Where was the rage, the desire for vengeance? Kowalski's sons were fighting, might die or be already dead, and yet the man sat eating lunch with German prisoners, treating them like hired hands rather than mortal enemies. Over the months that followed, Scholz came to understand something about America that no amount of propaganda had prepared him for. The country was not a monolith. It was a cacophony of accents, ethnicities, religions, and opinions, somehow bound together by shared institutions and a common civic identity. The other prisoners in the camp included not just Germans but Italians, and they were treated identically. The guards were Irish, Polish, Italian, Jewish, Black, Latino, a cross-section of American diversity that would have seemed chaotic and dysfunctional to Nazi race theory, but that somehow functioned with efficient practicality. And the abundance was everywhere, casual and unremarked. The camp received deliveries of food weekly, fresh meat and vegetables, flour and sugar. The prisoners ate better in captivity than many German civilians were eating in the Reich. Scholz's mother wrote him letters that made it through the Red Cross. She described rations that grew smaller each month, endless air raids, cities in ruins. She told him not to worry, that they were managing, but he could read between the lines. Germany was starving, and here he sat in Pennsylvania, well-fed and safe, watching American abundance flow past him like an inexhaustible river. The symbolic object that came to represent this abundance for Scholz was not chocolate or white bread or coffee, though he had access to all of these. It was the simple pencil. The camp distributed pencils to prisoners so they could write letters home. When a pencil wore down, you simply asked for another. There was never any question of availability. The pencils came from American factories, stamped out by the millions, and they were so cheap and plentiful that no one even thought about them. Scholz had grown up in a Germany where every resource was precious, where his teachers had taught him to waste nothing, where the idea of casually discarding a perfectly good pencil because it was half-used would have been unthinkable. And yet here, pencils were treated as disposable items, as trivial as air. If America could afford to treat pencils this way, how could Germany possibly win? One evening in April 1945, the camp guards gathered the prisoners and told them that President Roosevelt had died. Some of the guards were openly crying. The prisoners, confused, were led back to their barracks. That night, Scholz lay on his bunk and thought about the guards' tears. In Germany, crying over the death of a leader was mandatory, a public performance of grief that demonstrated loyalty. But these American guards had cried genuinely for a man who had led them through the greatest war in history, and their tears had been personal, not political. The following week, news came that Hitler was dead. The Reich had surrendered. The war in Europe was over. Scholz felt nothing, no grief, no rage, no relief. Only a vast emptiness and the knowledge that everything he had believed about Germany's superiority and destiny had been a lie. In the Pacific, the same story played out with even more brutal clarity. Japanese soldiers, indoctrinated with the belief that their spiritual purity and willingness to die would overcome American materialism, discovered that American forces could match their fanaticism while vastly exceeding their firepower. The island-hopping campaign of 1943 to 1945 was a grinding war of attrition, but it was attrition that only one side could afford. At Tarawa, American forces suffered shocking casualties taking a tiny atoll, but within weeks, the losses had been replaced. At Iwo Jima and Okinawa, Japanese defenders fought with suicidal determination, killing thousands of Americans, but when the battles ended, the islands were in American hands. Japanese forces were annihilated, and new American units were already staging for the next invasion. Japanese soldiers who became prisoners, rare, given the cultural stigma against surrender, expressed disbelief at American logistical capabilities. One Japanese officer, captured on Saipan, described watching American cargo ships unload supplies on the beach. "They had ice cream," he said, his voice hollow with incomprehension. "In the middle of a battle, your ships were delivering ice cream to soldiers. We could not even deliver rice." The ice cream was real. The U.S. Navy had floating ice cream barges, ships whose sole purpose was to manufacture ice cream for sailors and Marines. To the Japanese, this was madness, a waste of resources that could have been used for ammunition or fuel. But it was precisely the point. America could afford to give its soldiers ice cream because it had so much productive capacity that ice cream did not even register as a meaningful expenditure. The ice cream was a weapon, not in any direct sense, but as a symbol of the gap between Japanese industrial capacity and American abundance. When the atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945, they revealed another dimension of American power. The Manhattan Project had cost $2 billion, an almost incomprehensible sum, and it had been pursued in parallel with all the other military programs without requiring any reduction in conventional weapons production. America had built the atomic bomb while simultaneously building the largest navy in history, an air force that bombed Germany and Japan around the clock, and an army that fought on 3 continents. It had done all of this while its civilian population continued to eat well, to attend movies, to manufacture consumer goods. The ideological framework that had sustained the Axis cause, the belief that warrior spirit and racial superiority could overcome material disadvantage, had been systematically demolished. The German and Japanese soldier had fought with courage and skill, but courage and skill were not enough. The war had been decided not in individual battles, but in the factories of Detroit, the shipyards of California, the oil fields of Texas, and the wheat fields of Kansas. Klaus Richter survived the war. He was captured by Soviet forces in 1945 and spent 5 years in a labor camp in Siberia before being repatriated to West Germany in 1950. He returned to a country divided, occupied, and traumatized. The Germany he had known, the Germany of racial pride and military glory, no longer existed. In its place was a smaller, humbled nation that had to reckon with the enormity of its crimes and the totality of its defeat. Richter never spoke publicly about his wartime experiences, but he kept his journals. In one entry, written in 1952, he reflected on the Finnish ski troops he had observed in 1940. "We thought we learned the lessons of Finland," he wrote. "We believed that tactical excellence and warrior spirit could overcome material disadvantage. We were wrong. The Americans did not defeat us with tactical brilliance. They buried us under steel and oil and grain. They produced so much that our every success was meaningless. We won battles and lost the war because we never understood what we were fighting. We fought soldiers. They fought with nations." Werner Scholz also survived. He was released from the prisoner of war camp in 1946 and chose to remain in the United States. He became an American citizen, married a schoolteacher from Ohio, and worked as a machinist in a factory that produced agricultural equipment. He rarely spoke about the war, but late in his life, he gave an interview to a local historian. Asked what he remembered most vividly about his experience, he did not mention battles or his capture. He mentioned the chocolate bar he had found at Kasserine Pass. "It was such a small thing," he said. "A piece of chocolate, wrapped in paper. But it told me everything I needed to know about how the war would end. We were fighting with our fists against a factory. We never had a chance." The soldier who changed the war was not Eisenhower or Patton or any of the celebrated generals. It was the nameless GI, the farm boy from Iowa, the factory worker from Michigan, the shopkeeper's son from Brooklyn, who arrived on the battlefield carrying with him the full weight of American democracy and abundance. He was not individually superior to the German or Japanese soldier. In many cases, he was less well-trained, less experienced, less ideologically committed. But he carried a wristwatch issued by his government. He ate chocolate manufactured in Pennsylvania. He rode in trucks built in Detroit, and behind him stretched a supply line that reached back to the most productive economy in human history. This was the real weapon, the one that no amount of tactical brilliance could counter. The ability of a democratic society to mobilize its full economic potential, to organize its citizens, to produce material in quantities that rendered obsolete the old calculus of military power. The German soldier in his foxhole, short of ammunition and food, could kill 10 Americans and 100 more would take their place. The Japanese pilot, running out of fuel, could die gloriously in a kamikaze attack and the carrier he damaged would be repaired or replaced within weeks. The ideology of the Axis was built on contempt for democracy, for materialism, for the idea that ordinary people, soft, undisciplined, mongrel peoples, could defeat the hardened warriors of superior races. The war proved that ideology false. Democracy, it turned out, was not weakness but strength. A society that trusted its citizens, that educated them, that allowed them freedom and opportunity, could produce more wealth and power than any dictatorship. The industrial worker in Detroit, free to quit his job and take a better one, produced more tanks than the slave laborer in Germany. The farmer in Kansas, working his own land, produced more grain than the collectivized farm in the Soviet Union. The pencil that Werner Scholz used to write letters home, cheap, disposable, mass-produced, was more potent as a symbol of American power than any Tiger tank or Zero fighter. It represented an economy so productive, so efficient, so vast in scale that it could afford to treat even trivial items as disposable. And it represented a society that valued the individual soldier enough to ensure he could write to his family, that saw morale and psychological well-being as legitimate military concerns. In the spring of 1945, as Germany collapsed and Japan staggered toward defeat, American forces liberated concentration camps and discovered the full horror of Nazi crimes. They found slave labor camps where human beings had been worked to death in service of the German war machine. They found extermination camps where industrial methods had been applied to genocide, where human beings had been murdered with the same systematic efficiency that characterized German military operations. The contrast was absolute. The Axis had built its power on slavery, exploitation, and murder. The United States, for all its flaws and contradictions, and they were many, including systemic racism and the internment of Japanese Americans, had built its power on voluntary participation, mass education, and economic opportunity. German factories used slave labor and still could not match the output of American factories staffed by free workers. Japanese soldiers died of malnutrition on Pacific Islands while American soldiers ate hot meals and received mail from home. The question at the heart of World War II was not simply who would win, but what kind of world would emerge from the conflict. Would it be a world ordered by racial hierarchies and military conquest, where might made right and the strong dominated the weak? Or would it be a world shaped by democratic principles, where individual liberty and human dignity had value, where nations cooperated rather than conquered? The soldier who changed the war, the American GI, did not decide this question through any single heroic act. He decided it through the cumulative weight of millions of ordinary actions, supported by an economy and a society that trusted him with responsibility and equipped him with the tools he needed. He was not superhuman. He was tired, scared, homesick, and mortal. But he kept going because behind him was a nation that could afford to feed him, supply him, and replace him if he fell. And that made all the difference. Years after the war, the survivors on both sides struggled to make sense of what they had experienced. For the Germans and Japanese, the reckoning was brutal. They had been told they were superior, that their cause was just, that victory was assured by racial destiny and warrior spirit. Instead, they had been defeated so thoroughly that their nations were occupied, divided, and rebuilt according to the values of their conquerors. The cognitive dissonance was immense. For Americans, the reckoning was different, but no less profound. They had entered the war reluctantly, attacked rather than attacking, and they had discovered in themselves a capacity for industrial mobilization and military effectiveness that surprised even them. The war transformed America from a regional power to a global superpower, from an isolationist nation to the architect of international order. But the transformation cut deeper than geopolitics. The Americans who fought the war, black and white, immigrant and native-born, farm boys and city kids, had proven something about democracy that had been in doubt. They had proven that a free society could organize itself for total war without becoming a dictatorship, that it could mobilize its economy without resorting to slavery, that it could field an army of citizen soldiers who were more than a match for professional warriors and ideological fanatics. The pencil, the chocolate bar, the wristwatch, the ice cream, these trivial objects became symbols of a larger truth. A society that could afford to give its soldiers such things was a society with resources to spare, and that abundance was not evidence of weakness, but of strength. It was the strength of a continent rich in resources, of a population educated and skilled, of an economic system that rewarded productivity, of a political system that could coordinate effort without crushing individual initiative. The soldier who changed the war carried these symbols with him onto every battlefield. He did not consciously wield them as weapons, but they were weapons nonetheless. Psychological weapons that eroded enemy morale, that raised questions in the minds of German and Japanese soldiers about what they had been told, about whether their sacrifices would mean anything, about whether their cause could possibly prevail against such abundance. When Werner Scholz picked up that chocolate bar at Kasserine Pass, he experienced a moment of doubt that would grow over the following years into a complete reorientation of his worldview. The chocolate was not just food. It was evidence of a different kind of society, one that valued its individual soldiers enough to provide them with small comforts, one that had so much productive capacity that even small comforts could be mass-produced and distributed across the globe. Klaus Richter, watching American trucks supply Soviet forces on the Eastern Front, understood that he was witnessing the globalization of American industrial power. The trucks were American, but they carried Soviet soldiers. The ships that brought them across the Pacific were American, but they served the Soviet war effort. This was a different kind of power than anything the Wehrmacht had encountered, not the power to conquer and exploit, but the power to produce and supply on a scale that encompassed continents and oceans. The epilogue to this story is written in the world that emerged from the war. The United States and its allies created an international order based on democratic principles, on market economics, on the rule of law, on institutions designed to prevent future wars. This order was imperfect, contested, and often hypocritical, but it represented a fundamental break from the world of empires and racial hierarchies that had preceded it. Germany and Japan, occupied and rebuilt, became democratic nations and close allies of the United States. The transformation was not easy or quick, and it required a generational reckoning with the crimes of the past. But it happened, in part because the occupation was backed by the same abundance that had won the war. The Marshall Plan rebuilt Europe with American dollars. Japanese reconstruction was financed by American aid. The soldiers who had fought became occupiers who brought not just guns but food, medicine, and economic assistance. Werner Scholz, living out his life in Ohio, sometimes thought about the irony of his fate. He had fought for a regime that promised greatness through conquest and racial purity, and he had ended up a citizen of a messy, pluralistic democracy that he had been taught to despise. And yet he was happier, more prosperous, and freer than he had ever been in Germany. His children grew up speaking English, attending public schools, believing in American values. They knew he had fought for the other side, but it didn't matter. America had a capacity for forgetting and forgiving that seemed almost miraculous to someone raised in the culture of eternal grudges and racial hatreds. Klaus Richter remained in Germany, in the Federal Republic that emerged from the Western zones of occupation. He worked as a translator, lived quietly, and kept his journals locked in a drawer. Near the end of his life, he donated them to a university archive, with instructions that they be made available to researchers. In his final entry, written in 1985, he reflected on the war and its meaning. "We lost because we did not understand what we were fighting," he wrote. "We thought it was a war of soldiers, of tactics, of will. It was none of these things. It was a war of systems, of economies, of societies. We had built our system on domination and exploitation. They had built theirs on freedom and abundance. In the end, freedom produced more wealth, more power, more resilience than slavery ever could. We learned this lesson at a cost of millions of lives. I hope we have learned it permanently. The lesson, however, is one that each generation must relearn. The abundance that defeated the Axis was not automatic or inevitable. It was the product of specific choices: to invest in education, to build infrastructure, to protect individual rights, to create institutions that rewarded innovation and productivity. It was the product of a democratic culture that, despite its flaws, trusted its citizens with freedom and responsibility. The soldier who changed the war was not a warrior in the old sense. He was a citizen who happened to be serving in the military, who wanted to do his duty and go home, who fought not for glory or conquest, but to defend a way of life that allowed him to be ordinary, to be free, to pursue happiness. And in being ordinary, he was extraordinary, because ordinary people in a free society can accomplish extraordinary things when they work together toward a common goal. The pencil still represents this truth. Simple, cheap, mass-produced, taken for granted, but representing a society so productive that it can afford to treat even pencils as disposable. Every American soldier who carried a pencil into battle carried with him the weight of American abundance, and that abundance, more than any weapon, decided the outcome of the war. In the end, the Axis powers learned what should have been obvious from the beginning, that you cannot defeat a nation of shopkeepers and factory workers by calling them soft, because those shopkeepers and factory workers know how to organize supply chains, how to manufacture products at scale, how to solve logistical problems, how to keep the machinery running. They know how to produce enough for themselves and enough to share with allies. They know that waste is a luxury only the truly wealthy can afford. The war was decided in the factories of America, but it was won in the hearts and minds of the soldiers who carried American abundance with them onto every battlefield. They did not think of themselves as symbols or weapons. They thought of themselves as doing a job, finishing a task, so they could go home to the country they loved, a country rich enough to give them chocolate, watches, and pencils, and trusting enough to believe they would use those gifts wisely. That trust, that abundance, that belief in the ordinary citizen, this was the force that changed the war, and in changing the war, changed the world.